turned in to me, and I had one turned in Sunday night, but the person who turned it in is not here tonight, so I will wait till next Wednesday night for that one to see if the person comes. But several times, we've had the question turned in to me again, and I'll answer briefly. I'll just take about 2 of these each Wednesday night. And another one was the deal that the charismatics feel like praising God in dance. Where do they get their scripture? Also, they can just start speaking in tongues at their will. No, they can't. Robert Tilton, I'm afraid, if he hasn't already, is going to blaspheme the Holy Spirit when he gets on TV. And he just says, well, I'm talking tongues, and he'll just start, right on TV. That is absolute. That's getting as close to blasphemy as you can. And I don't know. He must have absolutely lost the fear of God. Because one thing, that look in his eyes, when he got a look in his eyes that just simply is not scripture, not Christian, I should say, spiritual. But you cannot talk in tongues at will. And I explained something about this one time. What we're getting mixed up, or what the charismatics are getting mixed, is the difference in the worship in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. You see, in the Old Testament, the Spirit had not been given yet to dwell in us. That didn't happen until the day of Pentecost. So in the Old Testament, worship was planned and orchestrated. You read a whole lot about it, how they planned their choirs, and some of the psalms they call the Psalms of Ascents. They were singing those as they went up the temple steps. And they organized dances, and they danced in organized dances. But you see, it had to be done as an organized thing because the Spirit had not yet been given. But now, do you remember when Jesus was talking to the woman at the well of Samaria? He said, but the time will come when they who worship God must worship God in spirit and in truth. And what he's saying is that will mark the end of organized worship as they had in the Old Testament, like in David's time. And after the day of Pentecost, worship would be in the Spirit. And dancing in the Spirit is great. Talking in tongues in the Spirit. But it's not an organized thing anymore. It's a thing in the Spirit now. And that's where they're making their mistake. By the way, when you're in the Spirit and doing these things, like in a recent service where we were there, well, even while they were out there dancing, they'd talk to one another. Now, there's nothing in the Spirit about that at all. There's nothing spiritual at all, and they're totally missing the mark. Now, I'll give them the credit for being innocent, perhaps, and doing it innocently. But they just don't realize what worshiping in the Spirit is. And a great deal of this so-called charismatic worship, and it's in our Assemblies of God more and more and more now, is organized stuff like they had in the Old Testament before the day of Pentecost. But after the day of Pentecost, we were to worship God in the Spirit. And they couldn't, but we can. And that's what makes the difference. They who worship God, he said, the time will come when they who worship God must worship God in spirit and in truth. And I don't know how many times through the years, and would you believe it, about 3 times in the last few weeks, I have been asked about our $1 bill. And folks have been so bothered why our $1 bill has the pyramid with the eye on top, because that's used very widely now in satanic worship. But I might tell you, when it was put on, see, this is the Great Seal of the United States. This is one side, and that's the other side. And the pyramid, I don't know why. Because when God's geometric design is the circle. Everything God created is in circle. Every planet is a circle. They go in orbits. Planets around, they go in orbits. Everything is in a circle. As it moves on out, even into the whole group of planets are called a galaxy. Everything's in a circle. Everything is in a circle in God's creation. Even our bodies are made up of little molecules in there, and everything's in a circle. Everything. And but with man, the ancient symbol of the pyramid I don't know why, but it's involved in human history from the beginning of human civilizations. Something about it that has, and today it has become one of the main symbols in satanic worship. What this is supposed to represent, the pyramid is supposed to represent the people in unison, and the eye is God watching over us. Because you'll note that there are two sets of words on there. I wrote them down here because it's so easy, so hard to read on there. Above it, you'll notice the words annuit and annuit keptus, which is Latin. He, that means God. God has formed our beginning. That's the Latin words for God has formed. And that God was therefore the setup when the Union of the United States was formed. Let's see, that's the first time in history we have ever had a situation where a group like states got together for one government. And it's that God brought it out. And below it, you'll see Novus. That's a U. Novus Ordo Seclorum. And that simply means the beginning literally of a series. Seclorum is series, but it means a new age. Basically the beginning of a new age. Because that's the first time on earth there had ever been a government formed like the United States. And the idea was this represents the people, and the eye on top represents God, that God has formed the Union. And that's the idea behind it. And they had no intention of having anything. But this has been used for various things. Let me give you a little example. Got a little time here now. May not get to another question tonight. But you see, we have a whole doctrine in our churches built on the pyramid. The British Israel theory. The British Israel doctrine. And folks, you remember me telling when I was in Egypt, I went to the Upper Room Mission, and the elderly lady there, Omi, such a godly woman, but she was a believer in the British Israel theory, and that is that the English, from the English peoples, the Anglo-Saxon peoples are the 10 lost tribes of Israel. And the only problem with that is that there never was 10 lost tribes of Israel. You remember the country of Israel had split in two. Here's Jerusalem. It had split in two just north of Jerusalem. And there were 10 tribes in the northern kingdom called themselves Israel, and 2 tribes down here. Well, way over here in the Middle East, there was Assyria. They came over and captured the 10 tribes and took them into captivity. Well, later on, Assyria was captured by the Babylonians. They came over and took the 2 tribes and took them into captivity, but they took them to the same place, and the whole 12 tribes got mixed together over there until no Jew today knows what tribe he belongs to. But because the 10 tribes were taken into captivity by Assyria and the 2 tribes by Babylon, a lot of people don't know it's the same country, and it's the same area, and they took them to the same place, mingled them right into the others, and so the Jews, you talk to a Jew about it, they just laugh about the idea of 10 lost tribes. Never have been any such thing. And they all got mixed together. But you see, it was the tribe of Levi who's the only ones who can offer sacrifice. And even though now, the Jews, if they ever get an opportunity, they've got the material ready to build a new temple. But nobody can offer sacrifice in it. They can build a temple, but they can't have a sacrifice. The man that's their high priest now, because you don't know whether or not he's a Levite. And so that's the reason in Malachi, if you read Malachi, that's what Jesus said, that when he comes to the earth, one of the first things he's going to do is purify the sons of Levi so they can offer a sacrifice perfect to the Lord. He's going to tell them which ones are the Levites. That's in the book of Malachi. When Jesus comes, he's going to purify the sons of Levi so they can offer. And but there's quite a few interesting things. In the British Israel theory, see, they believe that the Great Pyramid has in it. See, the Great Pyramid actually, there's a temple inside there. Like you had a regular temple building. Let's say like that's a big temple building. And all the pyramid is, they covered the outside with stones. And you could move the stones away, there'd just be a regular temple sitting out there. But there's a front door to the temple somewhere in there. And so for years they'd been wondering how to open it, because the king who had it built, his tomb, they wondered how to open it. And this Englishman, I believe it was, Englishman, got an idea. You see, the ancient name for Egypt was Masir. In fact, their airline today is still called the Masir Airline. Well, Masir is just a name for Mars. And so it suddenly hit this man. And so he went over there, and he waited until at a time when the sun and the planet Mars moved around and got in a direct line with the pyramid. And then he had his instruments there. He shot an angle from the ground, and where it came to the pyramid, he said, that'll be the front door of this temple. And sure enough, when they opened the opening right here, there it was, the front door. So he was right. I've been in there several times, 2 times I've been inside the Great Pyramid, and the British Israel people think that inside this temple, if we knew all the arrangements of it, it would be the plan of God of the ages. And they're basing that on Isaiah 19 and 19. If you want to go with me right there right quick, Isaiah 19 and 19. And it makes this statement, Isaiah 19 and 19. If I can ever find it. I know it's here. Here it is. And God said that in that day, and of course in the days of Isaiah, the pyramid hadn't been built yet, but in that day there will be an altar to the Lord in the midst of the land of Egypt, and a pillar or a monument to the Lord at its border. Now, let's show you something about Egypt. Here comes the coast, has the coastline of Israel around here, and comes on around here to Egypt, and on out through North Africa. The Nile River comes flowing up this way, and by the way, the Nile River is the only large river in the world that flows north. Every other large river in the world flows south or east or west. The Nile is the only one. It's the only major river anywhere on the face of the earth that flows to the north. And it doesn't flow all the way out like most rivers would, but it gets on up here and it branches. And it's got branches going off out here like this. And they call this out here the Nile Delta. Cairo is right here, principally on the east bank. The pyramids right over here on the west bank. And somebody discovered this. If you put a point out here where the western one of these right here enters the Mediterranean, put a point where the eastern one, Mediterranean, it forms a perfect pyramid. And that's where the pyramid sits. It's right there. And they put these things together, and so they say, of course, I don't believe it, but that's the pillar that Isaiah was setting, that the Lord set in the land of Egypt, and that it has in it the plan of God. And you see, they believe that it was the Israelites, during those several hundred years they were in bondage, that it was the Israelites who built the pyramids. But I know the big pyramid, I went into it, and they've only opened up part of it, just a little part of it. The king's tomb, of course, they don't even know how the arrangement of the building inside is, because you can't peel these rocks. They don't know what the temple would look like if you peeled all the rocks away. They know right about here you can go in the front door. And they have it fixed where you can walk up to there, and you go in there. And first, when you first go in, there's a little place like that, and then there's a hallway. Well, there's a hallway that goes over here. Here's the queen's chamber, where the queen is supposed to be buried, and there's a hallway that slants up right to the very exact middle of the pyramid. Then it's the king's chamber. And I went up there, and when you get to the king's chamber, well, actually, that comes into the bottom of it. It's only 2 feet high, and you have to get down on your hands and knees and crawl into it. Then when you get in there, you can stand up. But when you get in there, you can hit on the wall so you can hear the echoes going way on up through rooms all around you. And it makes you wonder, if they pull these stones away, what all is inside there. But there had been a tradition all through the years that the Pharaoh who had it built was so brutal, his work crews, and they say it's the Israelites who did it, that in the 13 years it took to build it, 13,000 men died in the brutal labor and the slave masters with their whips. And so the legend had been that when he died, before they could bring his body over here and put it in the pyramid, that some of the slaves stole his body and cut it into 13 pieces, one for every year, and threw the pieces in the Nile. And sure enough, when they opened up the pyramid, that's empty. There's no king in it. But what's an interesting thing to me, too, when you go in here and stand on this flat place, I stand on this flat place right here, over on the side, there's a hole about twice the size of a normal well. It'd be about like it's around to that bench turn around to me right here is a hole, go straight down. And they've got a wire fence here where you can't fall in it. And they don't know where the bottom is. The guy that was with us had a strong flashlight. He shone his flashlight down in there, and as far as the flashlight went, the hole just was on down in the darkness. And the Egyptian government or nobody, no archaeologist has ever gone down into the hole. The Egyptian government, they still consider that sacred. They don't want to ever be bothered. And so they're not making any attempt to go into any other part of it to find out about what the rooms are, anything. But you can hit on the walls here and you can hear the echoes just echoing all up through chambers all in it. But the British Israel people, and we've got them all through especially in England and places, that believe that the English Anglo-Saxon race of the 10 lost tribes of Israel, which of course is ridiculous, but they don't, that if you could uncover this and not get into all of that, the way the pathways are laid out, somehow it tells the plan of God. And you could actually know when things are going to happen. And they feel like that's what it says in Isaiah 19 and 19. But, and there's so much about the pyramid has always been a fascinating thing to men, and now it's fascinating to the Satan worshipers. They're using the pyramid in their satanic rituals. But the Great Seal of the United States had nothing to do with that. It was just the fact that the pyramid has always been the geometric figure that men have most used, but God himself based everything on a circle. Yes, amen.
Just a second ago, when you said about the Levites, after they're purified, they could offer sacrifices.
What's that now?
You said, didn't you say that the Levites, after they're purified,
they can
offer sacrifices?
Yeah.
Is that for God's return?
That's right.
Is this a blood sacrifice?
And the question you're going to ask is one that no theologian on earth can answer. Why, during the millennial reign, the temple rebuilt in Jerusalem, will there be sacrifices offered? And, well, I don't know it'll be during the millennial reign. I really don't. What I'm thinking is this, that the Israelites, no, when the Lord returns, that will be at the end of the millennial reign. That will be at the end of the tribulation. He returns for the millennial reign, and that's when he says he will purify the sons of Levi so that they may offer an acceptable sacrifice unto the Lord. There wouldn't be. What the only Schofield's poor explanation is one that I don't. He said, like the sacrifices of the Old Testament look forward to the cross, perhaps those sacrifices will be memorial sacrifices looking back to the cross, to keep reminding people that Jesus did die on the cross for sin. But the Bible said that all of his holy mountain, holy kingdom, nothing will hurt nor destroy, will not be killing animals for meat or anything in those days. But actually, before the flood, they were killing animals for sacrifice because that's what got Cain into trouble. But you couldn't eat meat. You're forbidden to eat meat. The first animal that we know of in the Bible that was slain was God evidently slew an animal because he said he made skins for Adam and Eve put on clothes. And up until the flood, you were forbidden to eat meat, yet animals could be killed for sacrifice. And unless Schofield's explanation is it, there's no other explanation on earth why it should be offering sacrifice. He takes the idea that maybe that they're memorial sacrifices, even though we can't eat meat during the millennial reign. We can't, and neither will animals. It says even the lion will eat straw like the ox. Animals won't be killing each other. We won't kill anything for meat. You can't have any venison or steak or anything during the millennial reign. But like it would have been before the flood, they could be killed for sacrifice only, perhaps. And that would be the only reason I'd know. And, brother, when you get the answer to that, if you will tell me, I know a whole lot of real smart theologians sure would like to know the answer to that. That's a question, brother, that's been batted around. And like I said, I don't know. That seemed like pretty thin to me what Scofield says, but that's as close to the truth as I can come to it. That like before, you see, before the cross, all of those sacrifices they offered in the New Testament actually didn't save anybody. If Jesus had have refused to go to the cross, every last one of those Old Testament saints would have been lost. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Samuel, David, the whole bunch would have been lost. Because Paul explains that in Hebrews, the blood of bulls and goats cannot take away sin. And they simply held off judgment until Christ died on the cross. They were looking forward to the cross. And if Christ had refused to have died on the cross, not an Old Testament person would have been saved. And on the same idea, it could be, Scofield thinks, that during the millennial reign, there will be sacrifices offered in the temple as a memorial to the fact that Christ did die on the cross. And if there's no other answer to it, that's just it. And that's another one of those things. Well, we're going to start a subject. That's the only thing I got some more questions, but I'm not going to get into them tonight. But I will eventually get these as they're handed in to me. And I hope I put my dollar bill away. If I don't, if you find it, you can have it. We're going to talk about something. We even sang about it tonight in one of the songs. The second song, it mentioned thine own sovereign will. And we're going to talk for just tonight and maybe next Wednesday night about the sovereignty of God. I don't even know if I can spell the word E. S-O-V-E. I thought there was an E in there. The sovereignty. R-E-I-G. That looks awful bad. I can do better than that, surely. The sovereignty and this of God. And when I first write it down, you say that's bound to be a dry subject. But before we get through with it, you're going to find that it's a very, very important subject in our living for God. I want you to turn with me to Psalm 135. Psalm 1. First of all, I'll go ahead and read this since I'm headed that way. Psalm 135. I want to read verse 6. Whatever the Lord pleases, He does. Now that's sovereignty. In heaven and in earth. And that's the way the Lord's Prayer starts out. Lord, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. In the seas and in all deep places. Whatever the Lord pleases, He does. Let me write you down. It'll take a little moment here to do it, but I want to write down the dictionary definition of sovereign. What the word sovereign means. And because this is going to get into why you have trials and things before we get through. Independent of and unlimited by any other person or power. Now think of that in terms unlimited. Independent of and unlimited by any. Now that's just out of the Webster's Dictionary. And then second, he goes to say possessing original authority or jurisdiction the sovereignty of God. The idea that God works independent of and unlimited by any other person or power. Possessing original authority or jurisdiction. Now, I'm going to Daniel chapter 4. And if we can, the reason I say that it may sound like when I first write the word down, it's going to be dry, hard to understand, and I'm going to make it very simple. And it has to, if we can just absorb it. You know, I've made the statement many times that you never really gain Christian maturity until you take the why out of your experiences with God. And if you can really absorb the sovereignty of God, it'll take the why out of your relationship to God. Why? In Daniel chapter 4 and verse 35, all the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing. That doesn't mean that they don't amount to anything, but they, as far as their power, he does according to his will in the army of heaven, that means among the angels, and among the inhabitants of the earth. No one can restrain his hand or say to him, what have you done? Can you absorb that? No one can say to him, can restrain his hand or say to him, why? What have you done? And that's what I base the thoughts I said. There's no why in Christian maturity. That's the reason in my heart there was no why at all. When I saw my wife lying out there with the car wreck, thrown out of the car, laying in her own blood, I thought she was dead. But as I crawled out of the car, God spoke to me, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Just as real as if you say to me, there was no why to it at all. There was no why to it when we said your son has just been killed instantly. Immediately God spoke to me and said, he does all things well. There was no why at all. And I'm not bragging about that, folks. I'm not bragging about that. It's just a place where you have to come to realize the sovereignty of God. And these two scriptures that I just read, if you can really absorb what those two scriptures mean, Psalm 135 and 6, and Daniel 4:35, and then we have enough confidence in God that we can surrender. You know, we sing that song, I surrender all. Well, then if you do, there's no room for why. I surrender all. Then why did you say, well, if God loves me, why did he let that happen? You see what I mean? Now, we're talking about sovereignty. Sovereignty. First of all, we want to look at the sovereignty of God. We've got this down. Now let me erase this. The sovereignty of God in our daily living. Number one. What's that?
In the 4th chapter of Daniel, in the 35th verse, King Nebuchadnezzar asked that same question.
What did he say?
In the 4th chapter of Daniel,
35.
in the 35th verse, King Nebuchadnezzar asked that same question.
I was going to mention that and then forgot to mention it. You see, I have it written right down here. In Psalm 135:6, that statement was made by a man, David, a man who was called a man after God's own heart. In Daniel 4:35, the same statement was made by a heathen king. I've got that right down here in my notes and forgotten. I overlooked it because I was going to bring that fact out. That those statements were made by two people, probably as far as on different ends of the pole as you could get. David, a man after God's own heart, the most powerful king on earth, heathen king. Now, the sovereignty of God in the planning of a daily life. Well, let's just say in the daily living. I'll say hour. First of all, from the time I get out of bed in the morning till I go to bed at night, and then while I'm asleep at night. Let's go back to Genesis 50 and the plan of a human life. In Genesis 50, well, here we've got 42. After Joseph's brothers he'd made himself known to his brothers. You know, they had sold him when he was a young teenager. They had sold him into captivity, into Egypt. And now that he's become the highest ruler in Egypt under the Pharaoh. And you know the story about him coming to get grain and everything, so we won't go through that tonight. But after he had made himself known to his brothers, and they were scared to death then that he's going to have them all executed. But he said in Genesis chapter 50 and verse 20, well, that's verse 19. Joseph said to them, "Do not be afraid, for am I in the place of God?" He's admitting that all of this was an act of God. "But as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring it about as it is this day, to save many people alive." What Joseph is saying here, way back there, by this time now, we could think he was in his late 30s or early 40s, somewhere in that area. Back there, and we think he was about 17 when he was sold into slavery. His brothers were so jealous of him. And first of all, they put him down in a well, was going to leave him starve to death. But then they saw this camel caravan coming by, traders going to Egypt, so they put him out of the well and sold him, made a profit off of him. And they took him on down to Egypt and sold him. We'll not go through that story. But you remember, Pharaoh's daughter found him in that's Moses. I'm getting out of Moses. Joseph, you know, he became a big chateau because he interpreted the king's dream. You remember how it went through all that, and the butler's dream, and the king heard about it, the Pharaoh heard about it, and he was promoted into a high place, and he interpreted Pharaoh's dream. You remember about the 7 lean years, the 7 fat years, and he got to be next to Pharaoh in power. But before that happened, while the prime minister's wife tried to seduce him, and because he loved God, he wouldn't be, and he jerked away from her, but he left his coat. His coat stripped off it did, and she showed it to her master and said that he tried to attack me, lied about it, and so he landed up in prison. But it's in prison then where he gave that interpretation to the butler, and got out. He became so next to Pharaoh. But you know what Joseph is saying here? He said that whole plan was in God's hands, because You see, the whole thing started when he was 17. God started working out this situation when Joseph was 17 years old, and the culmination didn't come until he was approximately 40. And then he had said there was going to be 7 good years and then 7 bad years. And so they had garnered up. And so everybody all around was coming down the time of famine, buying corn from them, because Joseph had made the right interpretation from God. And he said to his brothers, you meant it for evil. Back there when I was 17 years old, you sold me into slavery. Remember, they tore his coat up and put blood all over it and took it to his father and said he'd been killed by an animal. They said, you intended it for evil. But way back then, God meant it for good. And now, about 40 years old, the fact that I'm here and I'm in power, it was my dream or my revelation from God that saved this country. We've got corn the rest of the world doesn't have. That's the reason my dad and all my brothers and their families can come down here now and live. Craig, do you suppose that right now, how old are you right now? 21. Do you suppose that already at 21, God is already starting to work out things in your life for when you're 40? Yes. Of course. That's right. That's the sovereignty of God. And nowhere is it illustrated any more than it is in David's, and in Joseph's, I keep saying David, in Joseph's life. Now, I want to go to Lamentations. That's right after Jeremiah. Jeremiah. And very few people ever read Lamentations, but it's got some lovely scriptures in it. Lamentations chapter 3, verse 22 and 23. Through the Lord's mercies we are not consumed, because his compassions fail not. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. Of course, we have a song, Great is your faithfulness. Did you know, Brother Flores, when you got out of bed this morning, God's mercy was renewed in you just fresh, just like the dew was this morning. Just like it's starting out all over with God. His sovereignty. That the fact that this day, that if you'll walk in the Spirit, walk in God's will in the Spirit, every street you drive down will be in God's hand. You'll be in God's hands. And then, this isn't going to sit well. If you have a car wreck, God had to permit it. That's right. If you are walking in God's will. Now, if you're walking in your own way, that's something different. I'm talking about in the will of God. God's sovereign will over his children. You know, if you wanted to, you could call it parental authority. We call God as our Father. In the Lord's Prayer, it says, give us this day our daily bread. But the word bread there is not confined, the Greek word that's used there is not confined just to bread baked in an oven. It's a broader word that takes in all of your needs, our daily needs. And it doesn't mean, and this was in the lexicon, the Greek lexicon, it does not just mean material needs. It means also your spiritual needs, your psychological needs, your physical needs. It means the whole thing. Give us this day our daily psychological need, our physical need, our material need. It includes the whole thing. And what it is the fact that day by day the sovereignty of God directs our lives. And if we can, in fact, I put it down here, if you can remember, apparent failures, that is, failures of God to meet your need, apparent failures are part of the pattern. Because there are no failures with God. And right there is where we're getting down to into the nooks of this. Even Christian people have the feeling that as long as everything's going well, God's taking care of them. But if anything goes wrong, something's going to miss. And it'll be that way at all. It'll be that way at all. If I am, as I've explained it this way, out in the Navajo land, the beautiful Navajo rugs they weave on these looms. If you get around behind there and look at it, it's a mess. But on the other side, it's a beautiful pattern emerging. And when we're in the sovereign will of God, I mean in the sovereign will of God, there are no failures. Well, what do you think Joseph could have said? Joseph had done his dead level best to serve God. You couldn't have done it better than Joseph did serving God. So he goes up to take his brother some food to eat, and they put a rope around his waist, let him down into a deep pit, and leave him there to starve to death. You mean God let that happen? What the Bible said. God says God let. Even Joseph recognized it later. I wonder what Joseph thought when they pulled him up out of there, and they said, well, I guess they prayed through, but they sold him to this bunch of foreigners with a camel caravan going down to Egypt. What do you suppose riding along there on one of those camels with his hands tied together and his feet tied together, tied to a camel where he couldn't get away, bound up at night, because it took weeks to get from where they were. Probably took a couple of weeks more, maybe 2 or 3 weeks to get to Egypt. What do you reckon he thought about those nights? Hands and feet tied together. Knowing he was going to be sold into slavery. And all he'd been done was good all his life. Been a good boy. Done everything fine. Huh? Think what he thought. Well, he said later that was part of God's plan for his life. That's right. Sure it's quiet in here, isn't it? If it wasn't for the carpet, you could hear a pin drop now. I say that I wreck. For one, I think it may have been for other people as well. But I think our wreck was basically for the benefit of our 2 sons. Because of the tremendous healing that my wife got. That's the reason I can say apparent failures are part of the pattern. As Martin Luther one time said, nothing can happen to God's children unless it first passes God's approval. And I've heard that. I've made the statement through the years, and people, until they understand what I'm talking about, I say, a child of God never has an accident. Because if I'm walking in the will of God and God's sovereignty is ruling my life, He's bound to know ahead of time what's going to happen to me today. Wasn't He? He knows the future.
Mm-hmm. Predestination, isn't it?
No, it's not predestination. I don't have to choose to be in God's sovereign will. If I was forced to be, that would be predestination. But seeing time I want to, I can just disobey God. I can make my own choice. I'm talking about walking in the will of God. That if my life is turned over to God, and I walk in the will of God, you see, there's ifs to this. So it's not because anytime I want to, I can just make my own decision and walk right out of God's will. But if it was predestination, I couldn't. I'd have to walk in God's will, you see. Yes, sir. Uh-huh.
He makes a statement there, it's God's will that all men should be saved.
Yeah, it's God's will that all men could be saved, that none should perish. But I don't have to be saved. I don't have to at all. And that's where the Baptists kind of went astray on eternal security. They'll constantly quote, if you get into a Baptist on eternal security, they'll quote, there's no man can pluck you out of God's hand. Well, they totally misinterpret that. That means I have to willingly get out of God's hand. That nobody can force me out of God's hand. I have to be willing. Well, they don't look at it that way. They put the wrong emphasis on it. That no man can pluck me out of God's hand. But if I am willing to let God be my sovereign leader, anything that happens to me has to be somehow part of the plan. And God knows that I don't think anybody misses Sonny more than I've missed Bob. Even now, it overflowed me sometimes, and it was my wife too, and I'll have a crying spell. Just a few days ago it did. You know about Nathan, don't you? I don't know. But yet, I am so totally convinced that it was in the pattern of God because of what God has told me. I'm totally convinced it was no failure, it was no accident. We call it in human terms an accident. But there's no such thing as an accident with God's people. It's all part of the plan. And God has told me, and I'll stand by it as long as I'm breathing, that He took Bob when He did because something was facing Bob that was going to be more than he could cope with. You say, well, couldn't God have helped him? Yes, God could have helped him. But it wasn't going to work out that way. And God said, I took him before whatever it was happened. I don't know what. I have no idea. I don't care. But the sovereignty of God means that in the plan of God. Let's go to Isaiah 58:11, and we're going to have to stop with that one too. Isaiah 50. Well, I'm finding how there's three parts of this. We got part one tonight in our daily. Isaiah. Well, I went the wrong way. I was headed for the New Testament. Isaiah 58, and verse 11. And the Lord will guide you continually. That word continually means without 1 second lapse. And satisfy your soul in drought. So you see, that means there'll be times when things won't be going right. There'll be times when you'll be feeling spiritually in a drought. And strengthen your bones. That's talking about getting sick or maybe being in an accident and having your back broken or something. You shall be like a watered garden and like a spring of water whose waters do not fail. Through drought, through broken bones, or whatever he's saying here, the Lord will guide you continually, and you're going to be like a spring of water whose waters do not fail. And I don't say this except giving glory to God. It was 10 years old I was when my school teacher was told that I was to go blind before I was an adult. And they had sent me, and my school teacher had taken me up to Clovis, New Mexico. And they didn't tell me, and they didn't know I heard him say it. But I lived under that. And then when I was in Bible school, of all places, studying to be in the ministry, this hit me again. And it was for a couple of weeks or whatever, had to miss classes and had my eyes bandaged. And I was trusting God. I wasn't even taking any medical help that time, not a thing. I was trusting God. And the kids were bringing my food to me in the dormitory, leading me to the restroom, so forth. Hurting so bad sometimes when everybody was going to class and I was in the room by myself, I'd bang my head against the wall because the pain was so terrible. But you know what? God brought me through it. It happened again in the Air Force. And they told me I had leukemia. I was going to die in 2 years. Said that I was going to go blind in 5. Said I had a massive brain tumor here, and they couldn't operate or I'd die on an operating table. Went through all of that. They went through our car wreck. Went through our son getting killed. You know what? I'm still preaching. I still feel like a watered garden whose water shall not fail. That's right. I hope it's the end of it. I mean, not that I won't die, but I hope that I've been tried enough now. I'd like for this to be the end of it. I think I've had enough now for one person. But anyhow, that's what I'm talking about. God's sovereignty means He has complete rule over you, and nothing can happen to you unless God allows it as part of His plan for your life. And sometimes it might not be just for you personally, like my wife's terrible injuries. I feel that was for the benefit of our 2 sons. What happened to you might not simply may be for your benefit, but could be for the benefit of somebody else. But the point of it is, the sovereign will of God means that day by day as we walk with God, He has total control, and whatever happens, we know God had to have let it happen, or it couldn't have happened. Now, you see why I said this will take the why out of Christian living? If you can really soak in what the sovereignty of God's all about. What will we sing as we close tonight? Well, yeah, we just read that. Great is thy faithfulness, great is thy faithfulness. Morning by morning new mercies I see. All I have needed, thy hands have provided. Great is thy faithfulness, Lord, unto me. Let's just sing now. Great is thy faithfulness. Great is thy faithfulness. Morning by morning, new mercies I see. All I have needed, thy hands have provided. Great